Good morning, everyone. Well, it's good morning here in Southern California. If you are, let's see, on the East Coast, I guess it's good afternoon. We're so glad that you guys joined us here for the MAVEN webinar, 5 tough questions. We've got a great week ahead of us. I'm really excited about the different guys, the different speakers that will be joining us and really wrestling through some difficult questions. Now, before we get into today's question, let me deal with some business. For those of you who are out there and you have any technical issues, or you need the workbook sent to you or anything like that, any questions that you have, send them to info@maventruth.com. That's info@maventruth.com. And we've got one of our volunteers who's monitoring that and will help answer any questions you might have. Also, you can use the chat box that's on the Zoom platform here. And we've got my son, Micah, who will be monitoring that as well. Okay, so that's the first detail. Any questions, send them to info@maventruth.com. All right, there's been a lot of questions about the recordings. We will be working hard each day to get those recordings uploaded and the links sent out to everyone by the end of the day, so that then you will have an opportunity to watch the recording at your convenience. If some of the folks who aren't able to join us live, or you're gonna have to miss a day or two of the live broadcast, no problem. We will be getting recordings to everyone each and every day. Okay, hopefully you have your workbook. If you got your workbook, get it out and get it ready. That workbook was a 40-page workbook, but we put so much good stuff in there, it turned out to be like a 66-page workbook. So I hope you're happy about the workbook. You should have it. If you don't have it, again, send an email to info@maventruth.com. We can have one of our staffers send that out to you. If you see any typos in that, production went kind of to the last minute. If you see any typos, keep them to yourself. I don't want to know. No, I'm just kidding. If you see any typos, like major errors, please let us know at info@maventruth.com. We want to correct those. And I want to say a big thanks to one of our good friends, Gabriel Pagel, who put a lot of work and effort and time into helping us compile that workbook. So thank you, Gabriel. Okay, last bit of business before we get to our question this morning. We do have some giveaways that we're going to be giving away throughout the week. So if you're on the live broadcast, you're going to get a chance today to possibly win one of our very cool MAVEN t-shirts. And I think what we might be doing, we're going to be kind of randomly picking people. If you ask a question, that might be a way that you get your name in the drawing. We also have a book that just came out in January that John Stonestreet and I co-authored, called A Student's Guide to Culture. We're going to give away one of these, and we're going to give one of these to hopefully a student out there who is watching. And then if you are a parent or a church leader or a Christian educator, we've got a copy of A Practical Guide to Culture that John and I wrote, that's really geared for an adult audience. And so we're going to be giving those things away throughout the broadcast. All right, I think that takes care of all of the business items. All right, I'm going to get my PowerPoint up here. I'm going to share my screen with you so that you guys can see my PowerPoint. And I'm going to make sure that it's in full screen mode. Okay, hopefully you can see the full screen mode there. All right, today's question is really it's a difficult question. It's difficult on a number of different levels. If God is good, right? If the God that Christians believe in is loving, he's good, he's all powerful, why do we see evil and suffering in the world? Right? Why do we see bad things happen? Now, often the reason this question is so difficult is because it comes to us in moments when we are actually experiencing evil or suffering or pain. And that's exactly what happened to me. I grew up in the church. I had a great experience in the church. Um, I met a kid in junior high in 8th grade. His name was Danny Vasquez. And so I got to know the Vasquez family very well. Here's a picture of my friend Danny and his family. It so happened that his dad, Danny Jr. or Dan Jr., was the pastor of a church. And so Danny, my family was looking for a church to get plugged into. Danny and I were in 8th grade together. He invited me to his church. And so we started attending the church that Pastor Dan was pastoring. And so Danny and I became fast friends. We became best friends. In fact, we even shared a birthday. So we would celebrate birthdays together. But I was always at Danny's house. Danny was always at my house. And I got to know the Vasquez family very well. Now, obviously, you see the picture of the Vasquez family. There's Pastor Dan. You look at the picture and it's clear this is like straight out of the 80s, right? There's in the middle is Dan's wife, Bev, his sister or his daughters, Jenny and Jody, and then his son, Danny Jr. there in the glasses. So that's the Vasquez family. Well, like I said, I met Danny in junior high. There's a picture of Danny and I in junior high. Yeah, I agree with you. We were probably some of the coolest junior hires I can even imagine. Danny and I, we stayed best friends throughout high school, got to know the family very well. In fact, I saw Danny and I have kind of moved to different parts of the country. I stayed in Southern California. He moved to Iowa, but I saw Danny a couple years ago and I'm like, we got to take a picture together again. So here is Danny and I now. Apparently someone kept growing after junior high and someone didn't. Danny is he's like 6'5". So anyway, I got to be part of the Vasquez family in their home all the time. And, it was after I graduated from high school, or right around the time of my senior year, kind of around graduation, Pastor Dan was diagnosed with melanoma cancer. And so our church, we watched as Pastor Dan really battled this cancer, and he battled it for a year. He went through chemotherapy, he went through radiation. And I remember the doctors eventually getting to the point where they said, there's nothing else we can do. The cancer has spread aggressively throughout his whole body. You could see Pastor Dan, you could see his body just kind of racked with cancer. And he was struggling, and they eventually moved him to his home. I remember when they brought a hospital bed from the hospital to put in Pastor Dan's living room so that he would be comfortable for the remainder of his life. I remember getting a call and hearing that Pastor Dan had stopped breathing, that they had resuscitated him, but they had rushed him to the ICU at the local hospital. I remember that day going there, rushing over to the hospital, and there were just tons of people from our church who had been praying for a year that Pastor Dan would be healed. They were, showing up at the hospital, and the waiting room was filled with people from our church, and we were there praying and just waiting, and we were there with the family, of course. I remember that evening, there was no sign of improvement. Pastor Dan was unconscious, hooked up to machines in the ICU. Danny and I went across the street to a burger place, and I remember sitting there with my best friend, having a burger, and him talking to me about the possibility of losing his dad and never seeing his dad again. And it was just a surreal moment. And I remember that evening back at the hospital, being outside of the ICU, sitting on the cold tile floor, and being able to actually hear, Dan's room was close enough to be able to hear the heart monitor. And I remember that evening hearing his heart monitor flatline, and Pastor Dan died. And then right after that, I remember hearing a sound that I had never heard before. It was the sound of human wailing, because his wife, Bev, and his kids were in the room when he passed. And of course, they were overcome with such grief, and they were just wailing and crying. And I remember for me, as a probably 18, 19-year-old, that being the moment that I really had to wrestle with this question. God, if you're so good, why would you let Pastor Dan suffer like this? I mean, this isn't one of the bad guys. This is one of the good guys. This guy gave his life for the ministry. He sacrificed. His family served you. Why would you let him suffer for a year and die? And I really began to wrestle with this question. If God is good, how do I make sense of this? Now, of course, we are not alone in wrestling with this question. C.S. Lewis really wrestled with this question, and we're going to let C.S. Lewis kind of guide us this morning through this difficult question. In his book, The Weight of Glory, C.S. Lewis says this. He says, I believe in Christianity as I believe that the sun has risen, not only because I see it, but because by it I see everything else. Now, what is Lewis saying there? He's saying not only does he believe in Christianity because he has direct evidence, just like the sun, you can go outside and look up and you can see the sun. You can directly look at the sun and see it. And you can know, hey, the sun's out. But I'm guessing that's not how most of us know the sun is out. We don't go outside every day looking out and say, oh, yep, there it is. Okay, I can relax, the sun's out. No, he says, not only because I see it, but because by it I see everything else. See, when the sun is out, it lights up the rest of the world. We can see the rest of the world. And Lewis is saying that Christianity helps us to make sense of the world. And that is one of the things that helps us to know that Christianity is true, because it offers the best answers to life's biggest questions. Now, if you know anything about Lewis's life, you know that Lewis was no stranger to pain. Late in life, well, actually in 1940, Lewis wrote a book called The Problem of Pain, where he dealt with this objection. And in this book, The Problem of Pain, he helps us to see how God's existence is compatible with the existence of evil. And he kind of shows us how intellectually we can make sense of this. Now, if you know about his life, you know that later on in life, he was married to this woman, Joy Davidman. They were married, but after a few short years of marriage, she had cancer. Lewis knew about that, but she eventually passes away after a few short years of marriage. After Joy Davidman dies, Lewis writes a different book on the same subject. He wrote the book, A Grief Observed, and it really is kind of his journalings. Him journaling through now the experience of pain, not just thinking about it, but actually feeling it. And what Lewis says in, this is just a sample of what he says in this book. I want you to hear the tone and the flavor of this, but he says, but go to him, go to God when your need is desperate, when all other help is vain. And what do you find? A door slammed in your face and a sound of bolting and double bolting on the inside. After that, silence. Wow. Lewis is recounting his experience. When he was in pain, he went to God, and what did he experience? At first, he experienced what he took to be just silence. And you can kind of hear the anger and the frustration that Lewis has with God. And of course, I think God is big enough to take that pain and that anger and that frustration. And as Lewis continues to work through his pain, he eventually comes to make peace with God. But these two books are really coming at this question from two very different angles, and they help to illustrate a very important distinction that we need to make right from the beginning. There's not just one problem of pain or suffering. There are two problems. And the first one is what we call the emotional problem of evil. That is captured by his book, A Grief Observed. And when someone is in the middle of the experience of pain and suffering, when they're hurting, when my best friend Danny is watching his dad die over a period of year, he's going through the experience. When his family were in the room when Pastor Dan died, they are in the middle of that experience. And when someone is in that, they're not just dealing with the intellectual problem, they're dealing with the emotional problem of evil. And so what do we do? How do we handle that? Well, I think we get a great picture of how we should first handle that or deal with that or walk with someone through that from the book of Job. In the book of Job, right, Job in the first chapter goes through all kinds of pain and suffering. And what happens? In chapter 2, it says, now when Job's 3 friends heard of all this adversity that had come upon him, they came each one from his own place, and they made an appointment together to come to sympathize with him and comfort him. When they lifted up their eyes at a distance and did not recognize him, they raised their voices and wept. And each of them tore his robe, and they threw dust over their heads toward the sky. Then they sat down on the ground with him for 7 days and 7 nights, with no one speaking a word to him, for they saw that his pain was very great. What did Job's friends do? They come and they just be with him. They cry with him. They weep with him, right? They sit in silence for 7 days. When someone is going through the experience of pain and suffering, that's typically not the time that we come in with all of our answers or all of our Bible verses or quoting Romans 8:28 to them. When Danny and his family were in pain, that was the time for me to stop talking, to just listen, to cry with them, to weep with them, to mourn with them, to just hug them, to be silent, and to enter into that pain with them. And so it's very important to understand that on the emotional side of this, the experience of pain and suffering, I mean, people are hurting. And what they need us to do is to show them the love of God by listening and crying and being there for them and helping to meet whatever needs we can emotionally and physically. And so the emotional problem, the experience of it is one thing. And so we need to set that out up front, that is a very important part of this equation. Because sometimes when we look at answers to these tough questions, we can sometimes forget about the human side of things. And so we don't want to just come rushing in with all of these answers to make sense of it for them. Sometimes that experience of pain and suffering is a process that people have to work through, just like C.S. Lewis did, right? And he was someone who had written a book 20 years prior about this particular issue. So we need to understand that there is first the emotional problem of evil, and then secondly, there is the intellectual problem. And that's where we're going to spend most of our time during this webinar, is dealing with the intellectual problem. Okay, how do we make sense of this? Because the skeptic like Sam Harris, who's a famous atheist, he says this. He says either God can do nothing to stop catastrophes, or he doesn't care to, or he doesn't exist. God is either impotent, evil, or imaginary. Take your pick and choose wisely. So what does the skeptic do? The skeptic takes this challenge and he says this evil and suffering aren't compatible with God's existence. A God who is good and loving, all powerful, no, evil can't exist if that being exists. So if evil exists, that being doesn't exist. And so what the skeptic does is he takes evil and examples of evil, and he puts it on one side of the scale. I want you to imagine scales here. I think it's a helpful analogy. And so evil, the skeptic will put evil on the side of the scale against God's existence. There can't be a God with all this kind of evil and suffering. So here's what I want to do for the rest of our time. I want to look and see, is there anything to put on the other side of the scale? When we look at evil, are there any responses that make sense of it? Is there evidence that we can put on the side for God existence, so that at the end of the day, we can still come to the conclusion that even though there is evil and suffering, God still exists. So that's what we're going to do. So think of it as scales. All right. Now, the first place to start, the first response, or maybe the first question that we want to ask when it comes to this problem is the question, what is evil? Because sometimes the skeptic will say, well, if you Christians believe that God is the creator of all things and evil exists, well, doesn't that mean that God is the creator of evil, right? Did God create evil? Well, before you can answer that question, we have to answer the question, well, what is evil? What do you mean by evil? That's the first question. Now, without this, I think what it'll help us to do is answer that prior question, did God create evil? Is God the one who's responsible for evil? So let's think about this question. What is evil? How would you define evil? Well, I think there are some analogies that will help us to understand the nature of evil and what we refer to when we use this term evil. I want you to think of a donut hole. Okay, yes, a donut hole. How many of you out there, raise your hand if you've ever eaten a donut hole before? Everyone? Everyone? Yeah, and when you say donut hole, this is what you mean, right? This round ball of doughy goodness. We've all eaten a donut hole. Well, let me correct you. You've never eaten a donut hole. This is actually not a donut hole. You know what this is called? This is called a donut ball. That's what that is. Now, look, I got a master's degree in philosophy, and so I spend a lot of time thinking about things like this, okay? Now, so you're sitting there going, okay, what's a donut hole? If that's not a donut hole, I've been lied to all my life, so what's a donut hole? Okay, let me show you what a donut hole is. Precisely, a donut hole is the place in the donut where there is no donut. That's the donut hole, okay? Now, think about it. The donut hole is actually referring to something that's not there, right? Because, I mean, there's an absence of donut there. Okay, here's another analogy. Think about a shadow. Can anyone reach down right now, pick up their shadow and hold it up? Of course not, because a shadow is not that kind of thing. A shadow is not tangible, right? A shadow, when we talk about a shadow, we're referring to the absence of light in a particular place, right? So notice a shadow is the absence of something. It's the absence of light. Or how about blindness? Think about blindness. Is blindness a thing, a tangible thing? Well, no. Again, when we talk about blindness, we understand that blindness is the absence of something. Blindness is the absence of sight, right? And so notice there are multiple ways in which we refer to the absence of something. Okay, now let's take this and go back to the question of what is evil. Let's say someone had a knife like this and they used it to cut open another person. In that situation, would you say that the knife, the blade, is evil? What if it was used by a thief, right, to rob a woman of her purse, and he stabs her and grabs her purse? Would we then say the knife is evil in that situation? No, I don't think we'd say that knife is evil. That same knife, that same blade could be used maybe by a doctor to cut open someone to remove a cancerous tumor. In that situation, when we'd say, well, now the knife is good? No, we understand that that thing itself isn't good or evil, but it can be used for good or evil purposes, right? It really depends upon the relationship between the body and the knife. In the first situation, there's an improper relationship, an evil relationship. In the second situation, there's a good relationship, right? There's an absence of goodness when that knife is used to harm somebody. There's the presence of goodness when it's used by a doctor to heal someone of cancer. And that helps us to understand what evil is. Evil can be defined as simply the absence of good. Evil is the absence of good. See, evil is like a parasite. It's a parasite on the good. It feeds off of the good. It has to have good for there to be evil. You can have good without evil, but you can't have evil without good, because evil is the parasite. It's the absence of goodness. And so when we define it this way, it helps us to understand what number one, what evil is, but then number two, that God is not the one responsible for evil. Evil is not some stuff. Evil is not something, right? It's something, but it's not something. It's not tangible. Evil doesn't have weight. It's it's not measurable like that. You're not going to walk out your front door and trip over some evil. You can't go down to the deli and buy like a pound of evil, right? It's not that kind of thing. It's the absence of something. Evil is the absence of good. Therefore, evil is not something that God created, But evil, it turns out, is something that human beings brought into existence. And this leads us to the second part of our defense is what's called the free will defense. The free will defense. See, God, when he created human beings, he dignified us with the ability to choose. He gave us freedom to make decisions. And we disobeyed him, going all the way back to the garden, going all the way back to Adam and Eve. And they used their free will in disobedience to him and brought evil into the equation. And so it's actually human freedom that made evil possible. God created us with freedom, and we took that freedom and we abused it. And so it was human beings that brought evil into our world. Now, Lewis talks about this, but he anticipates the objection. Someone might say, well, gosh, was it worth it for God to do that? Couldn't God have created a world where we were good and we never chose evil? Well, here's what Lewis says in his book, The Problem of Pain. He says, God created things which had free will. That means creatures which can go wrong or right. Some people think they can imagine a creature which was free but had no possibility of going wrong. But I can't. If a thing is free to be good, it's also free to be bad. And free will is what has made evil possible. Why then did God give them free will? Because free will, though it makes evil possible, is also the only thing that makes possible any love or goodness or joy worth having. Now think about that, right? You can't create someone free and then force them to do what you want them to do. Otherwise, they're not free. That's a logical impossibility. So why would God do this? Well, because it's actually freedom that makes love or goodness or joy worth having. Think about the concept of love for a second. If I, met my wife, Erin, and we started dating and I really wanted her to marry me. And I said, Erin, will you marry me? And then I pulled out a gun and said, if you don't, I'm going to have to kill you. And I forced her to marry me. Would you say, oh, what a beautiful picture of love? Of course not. Or think about moral goodness, good action. If I say, you know what, I really want to help the poor. So I'm going to go to my neighbors and I'm going to take up a collection of money. And I show up at their front door and I say, hey, I'm collecting money for the poor. And I pull out a gun and I say, I need $50 right now. Give it to me. Now they're going to give me the $50. And even if I use it to go help the poor, would you say, oh, what a great moral action? Of course not, because they were forced. They didn't have the freedom to choose. And so it's not God who brought moral evil into the world. It's human beings. God didn't create evil. We brought evil into existence by defying a good God. And so God isn't responsible, but we are. And of course, the world is filled with all kinds of examples of human beings abusing their freedom and bringing evil and suffering and pain into the world. Okay, so what have we done? Well, we've given a couple of answers here. We defined evil, and then we showed how our definition of evil leads us to understand the nature of freedom and its relation to moral action and goodness and love, and the situation that God created us in with human freedom, and therefore the responsibility for the evil in the world comes from us, not from God. So that's what's called the free will defense. Now, a lot of Christians will stop there, and that's all they'll say. But there's a lot more we can say here. In fact, I think we need to, because that alone, I think, doesn't really cover all of our bases. This is such a deep question. And so we want to look at another reason, another answer. And here it is. God may have what we call morally sufficient reasons for allowing evil. It's just the idea that God may have good reasons for allowing the evil he does, because someone might say, okay, all right, I get it. We human beings in their freedom brought evil into the world, but God, if he's omniscient, if he knows all things, he knew this would happen. Well, why would he allow that? Well, given who God is, his nature and his character, given that he's all powerful, he's all loving, he's all knowing, it can be argued that he would have good reasons for allowing that kind of evil and suffering. Now, I think I'm going to give you an analogy to help us understand this, because I think this actually makes a lot of sense when we think about it. If you think about a parent, right? So I'm a dad. I have 5 kids. Here are a picture of my kids. Wow, I think it's a younger me and younger kids. I got to probably update those pictures. So there's my 2 boys and my 3 daughters. Okay. As a parent, I've come to learn that there are times when I'm going to have to allow evil and suffering into their lives. And so let's just take the boys for a second, Micah and Jonah. When they were babies, they were both really fat, chunky babies. Okay. Oh, there's the family today. There's the updated picture. There they are. When Micah and Jonah were 4 months, we had to take them to the doctor. And here's a picture of Micah, just the round, chubby baby. You can see all the rolls, just that beautiful pear shape of a baby, just a round, rumbly, tumbly baby there. But he was just this fat Michelin man. Okay, here's Jonah, who had 4 months at the doctor's. Look at those rolls, man. Fat little babies, right? Well, as a parent, at 4 months of age, we had a scheduled doctor's appointment for all of our kids. And I remember taking Micah in to the doctor for his 4-month-old checkup. And so we go into the doctor's. My wife and I go into the doctor's. We bring Micah in. I remember going into the little doctor's office, and the nurse gives us some instructions. She says, hey, I want you to take all of Micah's clothes off except leave his diaper on. And so we did that. We handed Micah over to the nurse. She takes him. She weighs him. He was probably 40 pounds at that point. She measured his head, measured his length, all that good stuff, right? Checked his vitals. And then she handed Micah back to me. And she said, okay, Dad, I want you to take Micah and I want you to put him on the doctor's table. And it's that doctor's table with a white crinkly, paper on it. Put him down there. And so Micah, he's so fat, he can't move. So once he's down, and he's just looking up at me. He's looking up at Dad. He sees my face, and everything's good. And the nurse says to me, okay, Dad, I want you to grab his ankles and hold his ankles firm. So I grabbed his ankles, hold his ankles firm, and I'm looking right at him. He's looking right at me. He's smiling, right? And then the nurse says, okay, Mom, I want you to go behind him and hold his arms down. All right, so we got to secure this guy. Why? Because that nurse, that mean nurse, she wheels over a little metal table. And on the metal table are 4 syringes. And I looked over and saw those syringes, and the needles were probably like that long. I mean, they were huge. And she grabs that first syringe and she goes right for his fat, chubby thigh. And she took and gave him a shot in his fat, chubby thigh. And she put that needle in there. And I think there was so much fat on this little kid that, there's like a 5-second delay where there's like this needle sticking out of his leg. And he's like looking at me smiling. And then it's kind of like, the change in his face. Oh, wait a second. He starts screaming and starts crying. And she pulls that out, grabs the number 2, puts it in the same leg, pulls that out, grabs syringe number 3, puts it in his other leg, grabs syringe number 4, gives him that 4th shot. By the end of this, Micah is crying. And I'm looking at him going, what did I do? I'm almost crying. Like, my kid is now experiencing pain and suffering. Now, when you hear about a situation like that, when you think about a situation like that, do you then look at the dad and the mom, at the parents, and say, oh, they are bad parents. They are evil parents for allowing that suffering for their child? Okay. Now, again, doesn't matter what your views on vaccines are. Okay. Just set that aside for a second. We're not going to go into that question. But in that situation, when I let a doctor do something like that, would I be considered a bad parent, an evil parent? Well, no. Well, why not? Because I have good reasons for allowing that temporary pain in my child's life, because I know there's some greater good. And so I have morally sufficient reasons to allow my kid to experience pain. And I think that analogy helps us to understand how God could permit and allow pain, even if I don't know what the good outcomes are, because he does. And the good outcome might not just be for me. There might have some other impact, some effect, right? In fact, even you think about understanding. How does understanding work into this? So like my daughter Ella, when she was 5 years old, by this time she was kid number 4. My wife's like over the doctors. She's like, you're taking Ella to the doctors, because she was going to get a shot at 5 years old. So I'm driving Ella over to the doctor's office, and I know she's getting a shot and she's 5 years old. So I know I can't just surprise her with this when we get in to see the doctor. I got to try and prepare her. And so I'm talking to her and saying, Ella, you know what's happening, right? We're going to go to the doctor's and we're going to get a shot, right? What do you think her response is? Dad, I don't want a shot. And she starts crying. And so what did I do? What did I say to Ella? Well, I just simply explained to Ella that I had morally sufficient reasons to allow her this pain, right? Okay, I didn't use those words, but I tried to explain to her that the short-term pain is for a long-term good, something that will help you in life. And so I'm trying to explain to her that I have good reasons to allow or permit this suffering in her life. Now, when I explained it to you, when I explained it to her, what do you think she said? She looked at me, she wiped her tears, and she looked at me and she said, Dad, okay, I understand now, let's do it. No. If you believe that, you've never taken a 5-year-old for shots. No, Ella said, I don't care. Dad, no, I don't want this. And so she cried and complained the whole way there because she couldn't understand, right? As an adult, I could understand the reasons why I would allow this. As a child, she couldn't understand that. And so there's a gap in understanding between an adult parent and a 5-year-old child. Well, if there's a gap in understanding between a parent and child, what is the gap in understanding and the gap of knowledge between a finite human being and an infinite God who knows all things, who can see all things, who knows past, present, and future? That's a huge gap. So there's no way that I, as a limited human being with my limited perspective, with my limited knowledge, there's no way I could ever point to God and say, God, you don't know what you're doing. I don't know what good's coming out of this, because I just don't know. And so, excuse me, Lewis addresses this in his book, The Problem of Pain. He says this: what do people mean when they say, I am not afraid of God because I know he is good? Have they never even been to a dentist? Right? A dentist causes us pain and suffering, but a dentist is morally justified. He has morally sufficient reasons for causing us that pain. It's for our good. And so what do we have here? Let's skip a couple slides. What do we have here? We have a second response, that God may have morally sufficient reasons for allowing the evil that he does. Okay, so that's our second response. But that's not all. There's a third response. It turns out that evil is actually evidence for God's existence. What do I mean? Well, let's illustrate this. How many of you out there have ever played organized sports before? Okay, me too. How many of you have ever played the greatest sport known to man? Yes, soccer. How many of you played soccer before? Okay, yes, the world's greatest sport ever invented. Okay. NFL football is a close second, but I'm a huge soccer fan. I played soccer all my life. In fact, I used to play in adult leagues, and we play every Monday night at a field about 20 minutes here from my house. Now, imagine I showed up at one of my games, and I got there like at the last second, got there right before the game's about to start. And I'm trying to throw my cleats on, my shin guards, and get ready to get out on the field. But in the meantime, what would happen before every game is the referee would call both teams to the center circle, give some basic instructions, and then we'd start the game. So let's say I missed the instructions. I get there for I get on the field right as he blows the whistle to start the game. And a teammate passes me the ball. And let's say an opponent comes running at me. I start to dribble away, and he slide tackles me. But he doesn't touch the ball. Instead, his cleats go right into the back of my calf. And I go down really hard, right? When I get up, who am I looking for? Some of you probably just said, the guy. That's because you're a sinner, okay? No, and I'm not looking for the guy. Let's say if I don't hear a whistle and I get up, what am I looking for? I'm looking for a referee. And I'm going to say to the referee, hey, why didn't you blow the whistle? Why didn't you call foul on this guy? He clearly took me out. And imagine the referee looks at me and goes, oh, you're that player that missed the opening instructions. Oh, well, at the beginning of this game, both teams decided that we were going to play today's soccer game with no rules. And so anyone can do whatever they want. They can make up their own rules. Well, what happens to my appeal for a foul now? In a game with no rules, guess what? There are no fouls. Okay, that analogy helps us to understand the universe. Look, in a universe with no rules, in a universe with no morality, with no objective morality, guess what? There is no such thing as evil. Right? In a game with no rules, there are no fouls. In a universe with no rules, there are no fouls. But what is evil? Evil is like calling a foul. This is maybe the world's most famous atheist. This is Richard Dawkins. He wrote a book called The God Delusion. And maybe the most famous the most famous line in this book is this one right here. Richard Dawkins says, the God of the Old Testament is arguably the most unpleasant character in all fiction. Jealous and proud of it, a petty, unjust, unforgiving control freak, a vindictive, bloodthirsty ethnic cleanser, a misogynistic, homophobic, racist, infanticidal, genocidal, filicidal, pestilential, megalomaniacal, sadomasochistic, capriciously malevolent bully. Right? I'm thinking, wow, Richard Dawkins, don't hold back, man. Tell us how you really feel. What is Richard Dawkins complaining about here? He is complaining, I mean, you could summarize this by putting it this way. God is evil. God is bad, according to atheist Richard Dawkins, right? Now, if he is going to claim, if Dawkins is going to claim that God is evil, and evil is the absence of goodness, well, the question becomes, well, where does Dawkins get his view of goodness? In an atheistic universe where there is no God, where does moral goodness come from? Is there such a thing? Well, Dawkins has written a lot of other books. He wrote a book called River Out of Eden, where he lays out his evolutionary views about the universe. And this is what he says in that book. He says, in a universe of electrons and selfish genes, blind physical forces and genetic replication, some people are going to get hurt. Other people are going to get lucky. And you won't find any rhyme or reason in it, nor any justice. The universe we observe has precisely the properties we should expect. If there is, at bottom, no design, no purpose, no evil, and no good. Nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. Wow. So here we find out that in Dawkins's view of the universe, there's no purpose. There's no God who made everything, right? And so what should we expect? No design, no purpose, no evil, and no good. Nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. Do you see how that view is not compatible with his first view? In a universe where there's no good and evil, you can't call God evil, right? In a game with no rules, there are no fouls. And here, his evolutionary views lead him to conclude that there is no ultimate good and evil. There's no objective morality. There are no moral laws. And so therefore, how can God be evil? Your objection to God as being evil falls apart. Now, excuse me, Lewis was a former atheist, and he had this objection too. And he says this in his book, The Problem of Pain. He says, my argument against God was that the universe seemed to be cruel and unjust. But then he goes on, he reasons through this. But how had I got this idea of just and unjust? A man does not call a line crooked unless he has some idea of a straight line. What was I comparing this universe with when I called it unjust? Right? And see, the problem of evil actually brings up an additional problem for the skeptic or for the atheist. It brings up the problem of good. And here it actually turns out that evil points us to God's existence. Here's how that argument goes. Evil is a departure from the way things ought to be. right? That's another way to say an absence of goodness. Evil is a departure from the way things ought to be. When we say something's child abuse is evil, we're saying it ought not be that way, and that there's some proper standard. Children should be loved and cared for. Abusing them doesn't meet that standard. And so it ought not be that way. But if there's a way things ought to be, that means there's some standard or some law. And if there is some objective law, an objective moral law implies a moral lawgiver. Laws only come from lawgivers. Therefore, God's the best candidate for a transcendent moral lawgiver. God is the best explanation for the fact that we have moral laws that govern this universe. Laws come from lawgivers. And it turns out then that evil is actually an argument for God's existence. And so we put that on the side of the scales. Now what's happening? The scales are beginning to tip, and hopefully you're able to see now how God's existence, as we answer the challenge of evil, is compatible with the existence of evil in the world. Okay, now I'm just checking the time here. I'm going to take a few more minutes, and then what I'm going to do is get to some questions. And so if you've got questions, go ahead and put those in the Q&A box there. My moderator is looking over those, and will be sending me some of the best questions, and we'll deal with some of your questions. Okay, I want to say a couple more things. I'm going to speed through some slides here, but I want you to see, okay, these are the three that I'm really going to spend time on, but I want you to see that there's actually more reasons that we could throw on the side for God. The fourth one is what's called the soul-making defense, and that's just distinguishing between God's purposes for us. Is God's purpose for human beings to make us happy, or is his purpose much deeper, and is it to form our character? Well, of course, God is interested in our happiness, but that's not his main goal for us. He doesn't want to just give us pleasure. He doesn't want to just give us everything that we ask for or want. Or think about that. If I have a child and I want their life to be filled with pleasure. I don't want them to have any pain. I just give them everything they ever ask for to try and keep them from ever being unhappy. What will I do to that child? That child will be spoiled, right? And see, God is not interested in that. He's interested in you and me. He's interested in our character. In fact, that's why verses like James chapter 1, verses 2 through 4 can make sense, where James writes, consider it joy. Consider it pure joy, my brothers, whenever you face trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith develops perseverance. Perseverance must finish its work so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking in anything. See, God is interested in our maturity. He wants us to develop character and perseverance. Romans chapter 5 talks about exulting in our tribulations, knowing that tribulation brings about perseverance, and perseverance, proven character, and proven character, hope. In fact, people who develop character are some of the most hopeful people you will ever meet, no matter what the circumstances are. And so God actually wants to equip us for a broken, fallen world. How we can best thrive in this world is not by getting everything we want, but by becoming the right kind of people. He's interested in something deeper than just our happiness. And so we could put that on the side for God. That might be one of the morally sufficient reasons he allows evil, right? We can look at the idea of eternity. 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verses 17 through 18 says this: for momentary light affliction is producing for us an eternal weight of glory far beyond all comparison. While we look not at the things which are seen, but at the things which are not seen. For the things which are seen are temporal, but the things which are not seen are eternal. Guess what? This life, even if I live 80, 90, 100 years, is just a blip when it comes to all eternity. And if I have to experience some evil and suffering for this life, but then after this life, that gets all wiped away, and there's an eternity of bliss with God in a new heavens and a new earth where he restores all things. Might I be able to endure it better? Absolutely. Our perspective, having an eternal perspective, changes view. So we would put the eternity on that side of the scale. And so you can see how the scales are balancing in favor of God's existence. Okay. In addition, it's important to note that when the skeptic raises the problem of evil, they've raised an objection to God, but they haven't dealt with the independent arguments for God's existence. I don't know if you know this, but there are more than a dozen solid arguments for God's existence. The cosmological argument and various versions of it, the Kalam cosmological argument, the fine-tuning argument, the design argument, the argument from consciousness, the argument from mind, the argument from beauty, the ontological argument. I mean, there's all these different arguments for God's existence. So whether or not there's evil in the world, there's independent evidence that God actually exists. So we throw that on the side of the scale. See, the skeptic can't just put evil on one side and say, well, that's it. No, they have to deal with all the positive evidence that we have for God's existence. And so when we look at this, we can, I think, clearly see that God's existence is compatible with evil and suffering. And so we're able to show intellectually that it is rational and reasonable to believe in God, even when we see evil and suffering in the world. Okay, now I'm going to stop sharing my screen here. And I'm going to pause for a moment. I want to come back at the end here and say a couple things in closing, but I want to deal with some of your questions. And so I am going to, let's see, I'm going to look at my texts that are coming in. And my moderator, who actually turns out to be my wife, Erin, is looking at the questions. And so I'm happy to feed me the questions, and I'll deal with the first one here, a simple one. Selah Butler asked the question, can you name those books by C.S. Lewis again? Absolutely. If there's a couple of books I would encourage you to read on this topic, it would be The Problem of Pain. That's Lewis's first book that he wrote in 1940. And he really deals with the intellectual side of this problem. And the second book is called A Grief Observed. And that's where he really deals with the experience of it. Okay. And actually, if you look at your workbook, your PDF workbook, at the end of the section on today's topic, there are further resources, and both of those books are listed in the additional resources. So Selah, you can find them there. And I would encourage you to pick both of them up and read them together, because it will give you a full picture of how do we walk through this difficult question. All right. Okay. All right. This is from, let's see, Josh and Katie Immel. Okay. And this is the question. What about the devil? Didn't he bring evil into the world rather than man because he was already there before man was created? Well, great question. Of course, it seems the scriptures seem to indicate that Satan actually fell, disobeyed God, rebelled against God before the creation of maybe the world. And certainly we would say angelic beings, right? So Satan is a fallen angel. Angelic beings were also given free will. And Satan and a number of the angels, a third of the angels, used that and disobeyed God, and in their freedom chose to disobey God. So they did bring evil into the world. But there's clearly from Scripture, there is something unique about human evil and what it does to our world, right? Because if you look at the creation account in Genesis chapter 1, when God creates our world, at the end of each creation day, it says, it is good, it is good. And then when Adam and Eve fall, they break that goodness, so to speak. And so I think the human freedom is what's responsible for the moral evil in this world. And of course, you look at something like Romans 5, where Paul talks about how through one man, sin entered the world. And so it doesn't put the blame for evil on Satan, but on humanity. So yes, we would say that there were evil actions taken by free will agents, angels, who and in that case, there was evil, but that isn't the evil that's breaking our, it's human evil. Okay, great question. All right. Let's take Mike Lopez. Mike asks a really good question, referring back to the Dawkins quote. He says this, he says, is Dawkins unaware of his inconsistency in logic? Surely someone has pointed that out to him. Well, that's a great question. From what I've read, now I have not exhaustively researched Dawkins. I've read, a couple of his books. I've watched a number of his videos and things like that online. You can find some of that stuff online. If I remember correctly, it was an English bishop or something who challenged him on a talk show with this. I'm trying to remember that video, but so he may be challenged on this. But even if someone's brought up that logical consistency, what I find is that sometimes when I talk to my own atheist friends, that they are sometimes they're unable to see that at first, and of course, sometimes what you will do to maintain your worldview, to hold on to your worldview. So let's say you're an atheist, and if you really think through atheism, a universe that somehow comes into existence out of nothing, or you have to argue that it's eternal, but there's no personal nature to the universe. There's no personal being who brought it into the universe. Therefore, it seems logically inconsistent to think that there's some kind of objective morality or moral laws. So I think what an atheist has to do is they have to try and figure out, well, how can I fit those two pieces together? Some atheists will argue that there is no objective morality. And I have some friends who actually we bring out for our immersive experiences that we do through MAVEN, where we train students and groups in, apologetics and defending the faith and answering these tough questions. And we have them dialogue with atheists or skeptics. And one of our skeptical friends, Mark, he will come and talk to the students, and he'll argue that there is no objective morality. And now we've raised this problem. Well, if there is no objective morality, well, how can you say certain things are wrong? And he just has a real difficult time grasping the inconsistency or being able to accept that he would have to hold to some objective moral view. Now, I have another friend, David, who is a good atheist friend of mine. We have lots of dialogues. In fact, if you go to the MAVEN YouTube channel, it would just be go to youtube.com/MAVEN Truth, or just do a search for the MAVEN YouTube channel. There is actually a video of David and I in conversation. It's about a 40-minute video where David and I are talking about this issue of morality. And the first part that we have to get to and clarify is whether or not morality is objective or subjective. And so he and I go back and forth. And I think it's be a great video for you to watch, for anyone to watch, to kind of see how I make the case for objective morality to an atheist. And David would say he believes in objective morality. And so that's our common ground. So there are atheists who will say, yeah, there's real good and there's real evil. It's objective. And, we agree on that. Now, then the question becomes, okay, where does that come from? What best explains that? And of course, as the atheist, he's going to have to come up with some other explanation. And I think his worldview does absolutely show that it just isn't consistent to hold to a godless universe and objective morality. So whether Dawkins is aware of that, I'm not sure. If anyone has any video clip, or you've seen something where he is aware of that, well, please send it to us. I'd love to see that and read that for myself. Okay. All right. Here's a question from William. I think William C.O. William says, how do you know when someone is ready to move from the emotional problem of evil to a more intellectual problem? That's a great question. That's a difficult question because there's I don't think there's any clear kind of black and white answer for that. And this is where relationship with people is so important. I mean, I just back to walking with my friend through the loss of his dad. And there were ups and downs. There were some days that he did well, and there were other days where he was struggling. And so I couldn't simply base, kind of my decision to talk about the intellectual side of things or just kind of be there for him. Oh, he's feeling better now, I guess we can get into the intellectual stuff. I think it's what's necessary is an adequate basis of relationship typically. If I don't know somebody and they've done, they've been through some horrible things and they're struggling, and I guess my default position on that is to just go and to love them as best I can and meet their needs and be there for them to kind of develop that relationship. But then typically when there's that relationship and when there's some safety there and the person is maybe willing to vent, that might give you some indication whether or not they're ready for kind of dealing with the intellectual side. Like if someone is really angry and you see the emotions are really raw, that might just be the indicator that, okay, at this point, I just need to sit back and let them vent. I just need to listen. And I think it's really helpful when we can kind of take it for God, so to speak. Of course, I think God can take it, but we are that tangible person sitting right in front of them where they can just vent and get out their frustrations. And often that's what needs to happen first before they're ready to even consider. Sometimes our emotions overwhelm us. In fact, we're going to talk about this on Friday when it comes to doubt and unbelief, how emotions can be so overwhelming. And so I think you just have to be in relationship with that person and just feel it out as you go. And sometimes maybe that person will let you know, hey, I'm not ready for that. I'm not ready for you to give me some Christian cliche or something, and then that's when you say, I'm sorry. Hey, I just, let me know what I can do to help you at this point. And then often if you are that safe place for someone to vent and to talk through these things, and they know that you're committed to them, then often they'll open up to you and ask for your advice. And I think that's just the best of all situations when they say, look, I'm struggling with this and I need help and I'm not sure what to do. Or I need some answers here. Can you help me? And then they've given you an invitation into that. And then you'll know for sure, okay, they're ready to deal with this. But sometimes it's a mix of the emotional and the intellectual. And it's not like someone just moves from, there's this clean break from the emotional into the intellectual. So it's just kind of an up and down, I think, process. And a lot of prayer, I think, needs to go into it. Praying for your friend, asking God for wisdom. Of course, that's when you read James chapter 2, when you continue on past the trials, then in verse 5, James instructs us that in those trials, when you lack wisdom, let him ask of God, who gives to all men generously and without reproach, and it will be given to him. And so we ask for wisdom in those trials and those difficulties as we walk with people. So that's what I would say on that. Great question, William. Okay. All right, lots of questions. Thanks for asking all your questions. Unfortunately, we're not going to be able to get to all of these questions, okay? So just to let you know, in your workbook, there's some additional resources. At the end of each section, we've created additional resources that have some books that we suggest, but then there's also some videos. And in your PDF, the things that are like underlined are links. You should be able to click on that and it should bring up a link that will take you to those video links. And so I think there's 2 or 3 in the on this problem in terms of the problem of evil. So there's additional resources out there. Okay. All right. All right. Let's see. Here would be, okay. This is a great question from Deneen. Deneen Horn asks, can you speak about natural evil? Yeah, that's a great question. There's a number of things I think you could say about natural evil. So natural evil would be things in the natural world. Like there's a hurricane that comes and it hits the coast and it wipes out homes and it kills people and destroys property. And we often refer to that kind of as natural evil, right? Well, how do we make sense of that? Well, I think a couple of things I would say. Number one, I would say that 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 is connected to the moral evil. I think Scripture is clear that when mankind chose to disobey God, that I guess the best way to describe it is that it broke the world. It broke the good world that God had created. And so we live in a broken world, and we see the results of that, right? And Romans 8 talks about the earth groaning. And so there's something about, I mean, there's the cosmic impact of our sin, and Adam and Eve's first act of sin breaks the world, and a broken world produces brokenness. A corrupt world produces corruption. And so I think moral evil still plays into this question. In addition, even our own freedom plays into that. Someone might point to like disease as, under the category of natural evil. But those are affected by human free choices, right? So if I choose to, if I don't take care of my body, if I make poor choices when it comes to my eating habits and my diet and my exercise and that kind of thing, well, that's going to have an impact on my body. I may be more susceptible to some of those natural evils. Or if, look, I live in Southern California, right? Southern California is the land of what kind of natural disasters? Earthquakes. In fact, our home is built on not far from a big fault line. And there are millions of people who have built their homes right near fault lines. And we know that there are going to be earthquakes. There have been lots of earthquakes. But I've freely chosen to put myself closer for whatever reasons, because I love the beach, right? I can't get away from the beach. I got to go surf. And so I'm willing to take that risk. So that complicates that issue, and it actually puts us in harm's way. But we live in a broken world that produces broken and corrupt consequences. There's more to say on that, but if you did a search, I'm going to try and get to a couple more questions here. But if you did a search for, I believe it's Paul Copan. Paul Copan is a great Christian philosopher. He's just a good-hearted guy, loves the Lord, but very good thinker. He is a professor at Palm Beach Atlantic in Florida, and he has I think there's a little piece online. If you typed in Paul Copan, natural evil, you might find a little article from him that goes into more detail on that. So you might want to check that out. Okay, I want to try and hit some more questions. I'm going to try to respond to some of these quickly as best I can. All right. How would you respond to someone who has left the church because of this issue? All right. And I want to take that question because I want to kind of balance here between the intellectual and the emotional, because this issue right here is a reason why people walk away. And I think probably that's an indicator that there's hurt and pain, right? So they've experienced suffering, they've experienced the results, the consequences of evil. So they are suffering themselves. And I think the first response is to really maybe spend time with them and ask questions and listen. And I mean that. I'm like, listen and don't defend God at that point. They might just need the opportunity to just dump all that out on the table. And I think you and I have to be, if I'm a mature believer and someone dumps that stuff out on the table, I need to be okay with letting someone express their anger at God or their frustration or their disappointment or their hurt and not get defensive about it. I think sometimes Christians, when these kind of objections get raised or someone's upset with God, then we get defensive. We get in defense mode. And I know it's hard because sometimes this is someone who's close to us. It's a family member, it's a son or a daughter. And we've got to do our very best to simply listen and realize it's a process. It's not just that one conversation. Almost nothing gets solved in one conversation. Instead, we need people to kind of process that. And it's multiple conversations. It's over time. It might take a year for someone to get through some of that hurt and pain. It might take 10 years. It might take 20 years. Are you and I willing to love people enough to walk with them through that journey? And I would say, so a lot of listening up front, asking questions to draw that out, spending time with them, all that stuff. And yeah, I think that's the way I would go with someone who's left the church because of that issue. Reach out to them, take them to lunch, spend time with them, keep building that relationship, keep maintaining that relationship with them, and talk to them about it, and give them that room to vent. And then all the while, maybe studying the issue yourself, so that when it comes time for them to ask that question, well, how do you make sense of this? Or why would God allow something? You have then some solid answers to give them. All right. Okay. Gosh, so many good questions. All right. So I think, let me say this. We do have a Facebook page. If you go to Facebook, go to MAVEN Truth. You'll find our Facebook page. We're on Twitter. I also have a personal Facebook page and a personal Twitter, and that might be a place that we can put up additional resources to answer some of these questions, because there's just so many good questions, and there's a lot of good resources out there. So, so I think we'll throw some more resources out there to help you guys process this, because there's so many great questions. Okay. All right. I think I'm going to do this. I'm going to pause on the questions, because I want to end this, and I think this last part will maybe answer one or two of the questions, but I want to end with a couple more slides. Okay. And so I'm going to share my screen again, because I think it's really important to understand that the Christian is not the only one who has to answer this question of evil, this problem of evil. Okay. All right. So let me share the screen here again. And oops. Okay. So Bertrand Russell was an atheist, famous British atheist, a philosopher, smart guy, and wrote a book based on a series of lectures he did called Why I Am Not a Christian. But it was known that Bertrand Russell would make a statement a lot along the lines of this problem of evil. And he would say this. He would say, no one can believe in a good God if they've sat at the bedside of a dying child. Right? And actually, this is not just, I think, an intellectual challenge. This is kind of brings up the emotional challenge, right? You're sitting at the bedside of a suffering child. And his objection is, hey, how can you sit at the bedside of a dying child and say there's a good God, a good loving God who's up there watching? And that's, of course, that's a difficult issue, both emotionally and intellectually. But here's a key point that I want you to understand. The problem of evil is not just a problem for Christians. It's not just a problem for people who believe in God. This is everyone's problem. Everyone lives in this world. Everyone experiences evil and suffering. Unless you're going to deny that evil and suffering are real, this is everyone's problem. And so, yes, the Christian who believes in a good, loving God has to give an answer for this. But guess what? The atheist has to give an answer for this as well. And so here's my question to Bertrand Russell and to my atheist friends. What's the atheist alternative? In fact, I remember being in a conversation with one of my atheist friends. His name was Ricardo, and we were talking about good and evil. And I asked him this question. I took Bertrand Russell's question, I turned it on its head, and I posed it to my atheist friend. And I said, Ricardo, what would you say as an atheist to that child who's suffering? What would you say at the bedside of a dying child? And I clarified it and I said, what would you say that would be consistent with your atheist view to explain what's going on? And to his credit, my friend Ricardo, he kind of thought about it and he said, well, I guess I would say crap happens. Except he didn't say crap. And I said, thank you. I said, thank you, Ricardo, because I think that's an intellectually honest answer. Given your worldview, all you can really say about this is that crap happens. Bad stuff happens. Remember Richard Dawkins' quote, some people get unlucky. You won't find any rhyme or reason in it. At bottom, this universe has no design, no purpose, no good and evil. And then he says, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. So on the atheist view of things, what's the solution to evil and suffering? What's the explanation? Bad stuff happens. You got unlucky. Oh, well. To that child who's suffering, well, you'll die soon. You'll pop out of existence. You won't remember any of this. You'll eventually be forgotten. I mean, that's the atheist explanation that fits consistently and logically with their view. The universe doesn't care. There's nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. The universe doesn't care. Okay, that's the honest atheist answer. And look, if you want to bite the bullet and accept that, fine. But what that shows you is that atheism has no ultimate solution for evil and suffering. You know, if there is no God, we're in a worse situation when it comes to evil and suffering. There's no hope for redemption. There's nothing that can take evil and bring good out of it. What is the solution to evil and suffering? I think only Christianity offers a satisfying answer to this problem. Jesus is the solution to evil and suffering. Who is Jesus? Jesus, God in human flesh. It's actually the God of the universe who created the good world, put us in it. We rebel and disobey him, and we break the world. And what does he do? He humbles himself. He loves us so much that he comes down and he solves the problem. Right? And here's another thing that we have to think about when it comes to this problem of evil. Oftentimes we look out into the world and we say there's evil out there, or there's evil out there, or look at this bit of evil and that bit of evil. But we also have to recognize that evil is not just out there. Evil is right in here, in every single human heart. And so I don't just have to deal with the evil out there. I have to deal with this evil. And when I think and reflect about my own wrongdoing and the evil I'm capable of and the people I've hurt, man, I need help. And thank God we have a God who loves us and has offered help. And he's died to take my evil, right? In 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 21 through 24. Jesus is the solution to this you were called, because Christ suffered for you, leaving you an example that you should follow in his steps. He committed no sin. No deceit was found in his mouth. He was innocent, right? When they hurled their insults at him, he did not retaliate. When he suffered, he made no threats. Instead, he entrusted himself to him who judges justly. He himself, Jesus himself, bore our sins, our evil, in his body on the tree, so that we might die to sin and live for righteousness. By his wounds you have been healed. You see, God doesn't just answer the problem of evil out there. He answers the problem of evil in here. By his wounds, you and I have been healed. He takes that evil and that sin and pays the price for it. And then guess what? He also deals with the consequences, because even though he takes it on, I'm still going to die. There's still going to be pain in this life, but we know that's not the end of the story. 1 Corinthians chapter 15, Paul talks about the resurrection of Jesus. And I want to close by reading these verses, because they're filled with hope. Christianity is the only worldview that gives us hope on this. Paul writes this: "Now I say this, brethren, that flesh and blood cannot inherit the kingdom of God, nor does the perishable inherit the imperishable." Right? He's talking about our perishable bodies. We're eventually going to die. "Behold, I tell you a mystery. We will not all sleep, but we will all be changed in a moment, in the twinkling of an eye, at the last trumpet. For the trumpet will sound and the dead will be raised imperishable, and we will be changed, right? We will eventually get resurrected bodies, bodies that are not messed up by sin. But when this perishable have put on the imperishable, and this mortal have put on mortality, then will come about the saying that is written, death is swallowed up in victory. Oh, death, where is your victory? Oh, death, where is your sting? Right? Paul here is mocking death. Death no longer has victory. There's no sting. The sting of death is sin, and the power of sin is the law. But thanks be to God who gives us the victory through our Lord Jesus Christ. One day, because of the power of Jesus' resurrection, this world will be wiped away. This body will be done away with. We will get new bodies. If we've been redeemed by Christ, we will get new bodies. And there will be a forever after with no pain and no suffering. And that is only made possible by a God who loves us and came down and took our place in the punishment for evil. And you see, the Christian worldview is the only one that really solves this problem and then offers us hope for a future one day without pain and suffering and evil. No other worldview will give you that. So if you don't like the Christian answer, that's fine. Where else are you going to turn? And I think the only place to turn for a satisfying solution is to God himself. All right. Well, we've dealt with our first difficult question. Of course, this is not just something that gets solved in one webinar. And so hopefully this will spark for you a lot more thinking and wrestling with this. We're going to give you some more resources. There's more resources in your PDF workbook to begin exploring. But tomorrow we will be back with our second question. Who chose the books of the Bible and why? And Jonathan Morrow will join us tomorrow. So tune in tomorrow, same time. We will see you then, and we will wrestle through another tough question. Thanks for joining us today.